Hello. Thank you so much for the invitation to give this talk. My name is Chris Weber. I'm the lead scientist for the WWF network on climate and energy. I was not one of the authors of the report. I was one of those 1,000 reviewers that Dr. Revy mentioned. And I've been following it very closely, particularly this part that I'm going to dig into a little bit deeper on these mitigation pathways that are highlighted in the report. I'm facing a couple challenges here. The first being that I'm the last speaker before lunch, which is always difficult. The second being that we're running a little behind. But on the bright side, much of what I was going to say in the first section has largely been said already. So I'm going to go very quickly through that first section, which is just the main messages that are at the high level coming out of the report on these mitigation pathways, which is basically the roadmaps to net zero. I'm going to dig a little bit deeper into 3 of those 4 transitions that Dr. Revy mentioned, and to talk about what the underlying report discusses is needed in those sectors. And then I'll spend just a few minutes at the end talking about the implications for business and science-based targets that WWF is involved in. So as we've heard, the high-level messages coming out of the section that I'm discussing here, which is on mitigation pathways, it's chapter 2 of the report, once it's finally compiled. It can be summarized as follows. The first is that we really do need near-term action. This has been highlighted already. Somewhere between 40 to 60% CO2 reductions by 2030 for 1.5C. As Dr. Revy highlighted, we also need to simultaneously be reducing these other greenhouse gases, namely methane and black carbon being the most important ones to reduce quickly. The second key point is that we can do this in different ways. There's different potential pathways that we have. There's not a lot of flexibility, but there is some, and I'll talk about the implications of that. The third is that, as Dr. Revy mentioned, the transitions need to be very rapid and system-wide. And investments need to drive the whole thing by shifting to the low-carbon technology and energy efficiency. One thing that Dr. Revy did not mention is another key message of this report is that all of the pathways involve some level of what's called CO2 removal or carbon dioxide removal, CDR, also known as negative emissions. This is an important part of the land system transition that I'll mention. Critically, this is a huge focus of the report. It probably hasn't garnered as much attention as it will as people dig deeper into the report. And critically, there's a very important trade-off between what we do in the near term, basically the next 10 years, and what potentially we'll have to rely on these technologies to remove carbon from the air in the longer term. So just to give a broad context here, how did the report come to these conclusions? There's a systematic review of over 200 total pathways or scenarios that were reviewed in the report, roughly 90 of them being 1.5 degree pathways and 130 of them focused at the higher level of 2 degrees. In general, the pathways are split by these temperature target they're going for, and as Dr. Revy mentioned, the level of overshoot, how far above the 1.5 degree target the pathway goes. So this table just breaks down kind of the levels, which we'll see graphically on the next slide, kind of what those pathways look like. A key message is that very few of these pathways are actually available that limit the warming to less than 1.5 degrees without overshooting to some extent. So it's going to be very challenging to keep below 1.5 for the entire century, and they require some very drastic changes, as we'll see. This is kind of the key figure from the summary for policymakers that comes out of Chapter 2 that describes what these different pathways look like. You can see, apparently I can't use the laser pointer, but you can see the vertical lines of this graphic I've put in kind of show what the pathways look like in the different key years. 2030 being the most important near-term target. And you can see this very drastic change between where we are today and where we need to be in 2030, and then where we will need to be in 2050, which is roughly around 0 emissions. And at the same time, as we've said, we also need to be reducing on the graphics to the right these other greenhouse gas emissions, namely, greenhouse gases and other emissions, such as methane, black carbon, and nitrous oxide. One of the key points of the report, again, is that there are a little bit of flexibility in different pathways that we can use to hit 1.5. And the report shows this by kind of highlighting these 4 what are called archetypes, or the kind of like headline example ways to think about hitting it. They're labeled simply P1 through P4, but you'll see a description. I'm not going to have everyone read this quickly, but I've highlighted some of the kind of key distinguishing factors out of each of these pathways. The left 2 are the ones that are probably the ones we want to shoot for if we can. These involve very drastically reducing kind of demand-side actions, so reducing how much energy we use and increasing energy efficiency, and a more broad kind of package of sustainable consumption that focuses on reducing material intensity of products as well as reducing the impacts of food. On the right 2, we kind of have first a middle of the road, which kind of combines medium levels of everything to kind of show what kind of something in the middle looks like. And then on the right is the one we really want to avoid if we can, which basically, on the right, we basically put off doing action, and then we have to very, very drastically reduce emissions starting in 2030 because we didn't do a lot before. And this is focused on high levels of demand. And we'll see why this is problematic in a second. Right now, actually. To highlight the differences here, I've kind of overlaid the pathway on the left, P1, and the pathway on the right, P4, and to show the difference between the two. And you can see that there's this kind of general rule that's highlighted in the report that the more we can do in the near term, the better, because if we don't do more in the near term, we kind of are putting more emissions into the air, the blue section of the overlaid graphic, that we're then going to have to remove later, the red section of the negative emissions. There's an idiom in English, we say, what goes up must come down. And that's exactly what's going on here, because if we put up these emissions earlier in the century, we're going to have to use these kind of radical technologies we don't really know if they're going to work to pull emissions back out of the atmosphere later. Which is why we really want to shoot for the earlier action, such as the P1 and P2 scenarios. I'm going to spend just a few minutes now talking a bit more about what do these transitions look like in kind of numerical terms. I'm a numbers person, so hopefully you will appreciate that as well. So the first case is on the energy side. This is the most obvious thing that people understand. And for many of these, I've kind of dug into the underlying report and made some graphics to show what those archetypal pathways look like, with the kind of greens being the P1 and P2, those near-term action ones, and yellow being the kind of wait and reduce more later. So again, what we know overall, and this is all, I'm going to show only 2030, and this is important because most people have a hard time thinking about kind of a 70-year time scale, what the world's going to look like in 2100. This is what we need to do right now. We need to, as Dr. Revy was saying, make drastic system transitions within the next 10 years. So all of these things are kind of showing what the relative values in 2030 look like compared to the world today or in 2010, which is not that different from today. So as we've heard, we need to cut CO2 and greenhouse gas emissions by between 40 and 60%. Can't even show on the graph what happens to renewables because it would just dwarf the rest of the graphic. But renewables will go up by about 300 to 400% over the next 10 years. And obviously, the more we do, the better. Total energy, which is kind of an interesting story here. The total amount of energy we use reduces in these kind of better scenarios, the P1 and P2, Whereas some of the others actually see an expansion in energy. Of course, if we do that, again, we're going to have to cancel that out later. So focusing very intensely on energy efficiency in this first decade is very important. Oil and gas is a very interesting case because you see kind of a very divergent path between these two things. Again, the yellows look quite different from the safer dark and medium green pathways. In general, they don't see as big of a change as coal, but we do see fairly large changes in oil and gas supply, even in the next 10 years. And coal, which is the big loser in the report, has to go down basically by 60 to 80% in just 12 years. This basically means, obviously, we can't build any new coal plants, and beyond that, we have to shut down over half of the coal plants we have within 10 years. This is a systemic change, quite obviously. An interesting case also is nuclear. Many of the pathways do see nuclear increasing, which I know is very relevant for the Korean context. It's important to highlight, though, that the report sees substantial barriers to this expansion. Many of the models that were used to derive this have relatively outdated cost estimates about how much nuclear costs, and there's also very good text in the report you can see in chapters 2 and 4 that talk about all of the barriers that nuclear faces in different markets. Of course, these trends continue out to 2050. In terms of urban systems, this is probably, it's all of the same things you can imagine need to happen in the transition. Within the building sector, we need total energy use it depends on pathway, whether it increases or decreases, which balances kind of more people gaining access to modern energy and getting increased demand for air conditioning, both due to rising income levels as well as due to global warming itself, and heavy focus on energy efficiency kind of going in the other direction. Another big trend we see is that there's a significant growth in electrification. Much more of the building's energy demand will be supplied by electricity as opposed to burning fuels in the buildings. This makes sense because electricity is much easier to decarbonize than burning natural gas. Within the transportation system, we're going to see kind of a big balance between several different factors. There's obviously going to be increased demand for mobility as incomes grow around the world, and we're going to need kind of the entire. What the literature tells us we'll need kind of the entire bag of tricks that we have to decarbonize transportation as much as we can. Electrification is a key piece here, going more towards electric cars and electric light-duty vehicles, as is energy efficiency, getting more hybrids and more kilometers, I almost said miles, kilometers out of each vehicle. But also, we're going to see some of these behavior changes. We're going to have to avoid some demand and shift some of the demand that would have been in cars to public transportation, walking, biking, etc. And in some cases, the literature tells us we'll probably need some amount of biofuels in those modes that are kind of difficult to do with electricity, such as aviation, shipping, and heavy-duty road transportation. Now, as Dr. Revy mentioned, the transition in the land and food sector is one of the more interesting ones, and it's one of the ones that I think a lot of people don't think about when they think about climate so much. But immediately here, even in the next 12 years, we see that we kind of need radical changes in our land and food systems. First and foremost, what this means is we need to cut the CO2 emissions that come from cutting down trees or deforestation to zero as soon as possible. By 2030, we really can't be doing this anymore. We need to be expanding the amount of forests as opposed to cutting them down. The emissions from agriculture, I won't go into details, but are kind of an interesting case. There is some reductions in them, partly driven by diet shift away from animal products in the sustainable consumption scenarios. But we also see that these are emissions that are going to be relatively hard to cut, and we don't exactly know how we're going to deal with them in the longer term, except through dietary change. Another key thing to mention here is that I should also say that land use, how we use our land will change quite a lot in 2030 and even more heavily in 2050 and 2100. The trade-offs that we see we see some substantial trade-offs because we're pretty much using all of the land we have already. And anything that we want to increase the amount of land we're using, we have to decrease the amount of land we're using for something else. So by 2050, we're already seeing kind of big trade-offs between land for food, which is kind of land being used for pasturing and growing crops, and land for mitigation, such as growing energy crops and growing more forests, which will help us suck up that CO2. And critically, very important for ecosystems, the choice between whether the pathway kind of primarily plants energy crops versus primarily plants forest is kind of dependent on a lot of factors and is really a kind of societal choice that we have to make because we know that we do need to remove some amount of CO2 and there are trade-offs to both of them. Land will get covered in more detail in another IPCC report, which is probably not as widely known about, that's going to come out next year on land in 2019. So I will spend just a couple minutes now talking about the implications of the report for companies and science-based targets, which has been mentioned several times, and I know some of my colleagues will talk about later in the day. So it should be obvious that I know there's a lot of companies in the room. Companies are kind of increasingly interested in these mitigation pathways for two primary reasons. The first is focused on climate-related risk, how climate change and mitigation will affect their bottom line. And the kind of key trend here has been driven by the Financial Stability Board Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which is a mouthful, but the TCFD. Which I think we'll hear more about later today. And then the other main driver is that companies are increasingly stepping up and saying, you know, I want to align what my business model with this 1.5 and 2 degree future, which is the primary trend there being the Science-Based Targets Initiative that WWF is a part of, as is the UN Global Compact. Again, it should be obvious that companies play a key role in these transitions that we need. And critically, SR 1.5 is going to provide a lot of key tools for companies to kind of understand what these transitions look like. The first is that there are updated 2 degree pathways. This is less mentioned and thought about to date, but there are over 130 pathways at the 2 degree level that are going to be very relevant because the FSB task force specifically mentions 2 degree transitions as an important part of the analysis, and all of these scenarios will eventually be open and public. Much of it's already actually available, so companies can kind of get started today. There's much of the underlying science is already available at the website listed here. And just, I'm also been asked to kind of speak on behalf of the Science-Based Targets Initiative to kind of describe how we're going to be taking into account this special report. As was mentioned, we already have kind of nearly 500 companies signed up to set GHG reduction targets in line with Paris. The initiative itself kind of recognizes the urgency that's come out of this report, showing that we really do want to be shooting for 1.5 instead of 2 as much as possible. So in the coming months, what we're going to do is basically update the underlying scenarios that are being used for the Science-Based Targets Initiative so that companies will have kind of updated tools to assess their business models and make sure that they're using the most up-to-date science when they're looking at their future. So you can expect revisions in early 2019 for those of you that do work for companies and are working with the initiative. And that is all I had. Thank you very much for the opportunity.